Mrs. Kim smiled brightly when Ryan showed her pregnancy test, which was positive. She said as she shared a warm hug with Ryan. She explained happily. Mrs. Kim just chuckled at her daughter's behavior. Saga smirked. Ryan quickly looked at her. She was curious about the situation as well. Mrs. Kim smiled at her as she ended her words. She mocked her, laughing sarcastically. Vine was pissed. It bothered her how rude she was behaving towards her. She smirked, seeing Ryan sad. Saga left from there, rolling her eyes in disgust. Vine couldn't stand it anymore and left the living room. Her father saw Saga going out and stood up. He scolded angrily. She left without saying anything further. She sighed as she walked in the backyard. She muttered as she lay down on the grass, staring at the sky. After thinking deeply, she came up with a plan. She smirked. Ryan giggled while talking on the phone. Jungkook chuckled at his wise word. He teased and heard Ryan giggle from across the line. That made him grin. She joked as she laughed. He said, sounding very serious. She asked and pressed her lips. He whined, making her laugh more. He told her, smiling from ear to ear. She said, hanging up. She chuckled. Jungkook entered the wine's parent mansion with a lot of gifts and flowers. He walked into the living room where Mrs. Kim was sitting alone waiting for him. Once he arrived, she smiled at him. She looked at all the presents and then him. He answered by placing present on the dining table. She yelled as Waihan was in her room. After a few moments, Waihan started to come downstairs in excitement, but before someone could stop her, her foot slipped and she fell hard. Everyone gasped. Vian groaned in pain and clenched her stomach tightly. She breathed out. Jungkook immediately carried her in his arm and made his way to the hospital. Jungkook was breathing heavily. He didn't know what to do or say at this point. He was clueless why Vian was holding her stomach. Jungkook immediately looked at her in shock and she nodded. He asked, making her soft. They were quiet after that until the doctor finally showed up to talk to them. Jungkook closed his eyes and heaved a deep breath to calm himself down. The doctor said and headed back to the Vian's ward. He whispered under his breath and walked out of the hospital to teach the person a good lesson. He was sitting on his luxurious chair. His aura was changed, which no one ever wanted to see. Saka was standing in front of him, looking down at her feet. She regretted her decision. Jungkook questioned angrily. Saka didn't respond. Instead, she kept silent. He yelled, making Saga flinch. She was terrified and tried to run, but his man caught her. He yelled again. She screamed and threw herself at him. He roared while throwing her off him. He was furious with her and couldn't believe what she said. His voice raised and his veins started popping out. Saga gulped nervously, afraid of him. He looked at her coldly yet enraged. He wanted to teach her a lesson but couldn't because she was Vian's sister and he didn't want Vian to be sad at any cost. His anger subsided. He took out his phone and dialed Vian's father's number. He snapped and hung up immediately. Jungkook's eyes were full of hatred, anger, and fear. Fear to lose Vian. Vian opened her eyes as soon as her vision got clear. She smiled, looking at her husband's worried face. He hugged her tightly. She chuckled. He pulled away and cupped her face in his hands. He checked on her carefully. She caresses his cheek softly. Janko smiled, feeling relieved. He was guilty too since he knew about Saga and he wanted to punish her. But then he thought crossed his mind. he asked, looking at her closely, worriedly. He nodded understandingly. She pouted a little. He kissed her forehead lovingly. She pouted more, making him chuckle. Janko sat on the bed, pulled her close to him. Wayan took the opportunity and sat on his lap and wrapped her arms around his neck. He smiled. Wayan placed her lips on his and started kissing passionately, pulling him closer. When they broke apart, Wayan rested her forehead against his. They just stared at each other, not saying anything. She said as she licked her lower lip, looking at his lip, making his heartbeats increase. Jungkook looked away, being shy in her gaze. She giggled while talking to her belly, which wasn't even visible. He blushed but smiled. He loved seeing her like this, happy and content. She kissed him once again, softly this time. Jungkook wrapped his arm around her waist and held her tight to him. She leaned her head into his chest. He buried his nose in her hair.